Global Voices on Taiwan. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Global Voices on Taiwan. I'm Rath Wang, a news producer and anchor.
Hello, everybody. My name is Vincent Chao. I'm a spokesperson for the Lie campaign. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be exploring with you on how the latest world events from near and afar, how to impact Taiwan, and how this island nation shakes the world. We will continue to invite a number of international journalists, experts, and policymakers in future episodes to talk about Taiwan and to share their thoughts on current events here.
With us today is Marcin Jerzewski, head of the Taiwan office of the European Value Center for Security Policy. Marcin is fluent in 7 languages. Can you talk a bit about that, Marcin?
Rath, first and foremost, thank you so much for having me on the episode this morning. Well, you mentioned my language skills. I come from Poland, and that is something that is quite typical to the European experience. You know, we have to be aware that our mother tongues are minority languages, usually spoken only within a rather limited population of our country. So I definitely benefited from language-forward design of curricula in Europe. And it's great to have moved from a country that celebrates multilingualism to education to Taiwan, a country that celebrates multilingualism in everyday experience.
Well, thank you so much, Marcin. Well, today's topic is really to talk about NATO and to talk about Europe and European security and how all of this impacts Taiwan. And I wanted to hear your perspectives to start. Number one, on how do Europeans see NATO? Like, what is NATO's primary purpose? Has NATO provided security for people across Europe? That's the first part. And then second part is to push back a little bit and to hear your thoughts as, a Central European perspective on this narrative that is sort of prevalent here in Taiwan on how NATO has instigated this war in Ukraine and how the Russian invasion of Ukraine was started by NATO. I mean, that sounds preposterous, but how do you see it?
I think that it is important to understand that Europe is not a monolith. It is not homogeneous. It means that not everyone in Europe thinks the same, and not all countries in Europe had a similar historical experience, which means that a political landscape in European countries today is quite divergent. However, when we look at NATO from a Central European perspective, we can understand it as an alliance that seeks to foster security and political cooperation, not only within Europe, but in a transatlantic context, meaning bringing Europe and North America closer together. And particularly in the 1990s, when Central European countries began their transition to democracy, and here as a side note, this is something that Taiwan and Central Eastern European countries have in common. Our transitions to democracy began at a relatively similar time. So in the 1990s, the possibility of membership in the NATO was seen as a way of returning to Europe. It was seen as a way of really cementing the processes of democratization also in the international arena. And I think that this links well to your second question. When we think about NATO, we have to remember that you have to opt in to become a member of NATO. You are not a member of NATO by coercion. So when we think about, for example, Ukraine's bid for NATO membership, we should understand it as something that comes out of the volition of the people of Ukraine. They do want to join the alliance, as did people of Central Eastern European countries throughout the past 30 years over the course of democratic consolidation. So when we say that the war in Ukraine was artificially created by the NATO, we inherently take away the agency of Ukrainian people. And this is a big flaw. So I think that Ukraine is just trying to catch up with other countries in the region and also become a part of this larger security and political bloc that NATO constitutes.
So the way you've described it is NATO has been sort of like a security blanket for countries that are undergoing democratic transitions. And what we've seen in Europe, at least, is that the more democratic countries are, the more they feel a sense of belonging, not only within this European values idea, but also within NATO itself. And so that was reflected, I think, after 2014 during the Maidan protests in Kiev. So I guess the point, and I just wanted to emphasize is if this question would be, do you think NATO has been an important security guarantee for countries that are undergoing democratic transitions?
Definitely, NATO is an important security guarantor for all of its members, but especially countries where processes of democratic consolidation are still ongoing for countries which might be more vulnerable due to this transition. And we are seeing that countries that have come out of the previous authoritarian forms of government have an active interest in becoming members of NATO. So that's reflected, for example, in the ongoing bid for membership that was expressed by Ukraine, but also, for example, by Georgia, that has also spoken about its potential to join NATO in the future.
You mentioned a very interesting point in terms of the agency of the people of Ukraine. We see comparisons with that in Taiwan, and NATO's been talking a lot about Taiwan recently. Why is that?
I think that there is a realization within NATO and in general within international institutions that the global balance of power is increasingly shifting towards the Indo-Pacific. Also, in the transatlantic context, we are seeing the consequences of the rise of China. China is trying to make its footprint more pronounced in the transatlantic context. And that's why we come to understand that transatlantic security that NATO seeks to safeguard is inherently connected to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, tensions in the Taiwan Strait that an increasingly belligerent Beijing is exacerbating are of primary concern to members of the NATO. As we speak, we are now considering the aftermath of the Vilnius summit of the NATO. It is quite important that for the second year in a row, following last year's Madrid summit, we see that 4 heads of Indo-Pacific countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, were present at the summit. So this is just a very tangible manifestation of that dynamic which I just described, of a realization of the interconnectedness of the two regions.
You mentioned the word of the day, China. How does this actually
Thinking about
relate
that.
to Taiwan? Because you talked a bit earlier about the will of the people of Ukraine, and also we have the will of the people of Taiwan. Can you compare that so that our international audience can understand a bit?
I think that Taiwan, of course, finds itself in a very difficult international position, meaning that unlike Ukraine, Taiwan is not recognized as an independent sovereign state by majority of countries around the world, which also limits Taiwan's potential to participate in international organizations. We see multiple examples of that, for example, in the UN and its agencies. But a bid for Taiwan to, for example, cooperate with Quad countries under a Quad Plus formula is often seen as equally controversial. So I don't think that it is really an apples-to-apples comparison between Ukraine and Taiwan. However, we have seen ingenuity of Taiwanese people and Taiwanese government to try to broaden Taiwan's international space and try to foster connections with international organizations, multilateral formats, and also bilaterally, which I think can be compared to what we are seeing in Ukraine. Having liberated itself from authoritarian rule as one of the Soviet republics, Ukraine is trying to figure out its own place in the international system, and so is Taiwan now in its 4th decade since processes of democratization began.
I mean, I completely agree with what you said, Marcin. I mean, Taiwan is not Ukraine. Ukraine is, in a sense, not Taiwan. I mean, we have a completely different security, economics, geostrategic situation. But certainly, I think both our countries are under phase from authoritarian neighbors. And, you know, you work at the European Values Center. And how would you see European values as a whole when we take this in the context of encroaching or increasing authoritarianism anywhere in the world, and what are the steps you would propose for countries to work together to sort of push back against these authoritarian tendencies that are being spread around the world today?
There is a number of ways in which we can define European values, but the most parsimonious definition of what European values stands for is democracy, human rights, and the rule of law.
Oh, sounds like global values.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So these are values that globally we try to uphold, and that authoritarian powers globally try to undermine and redefine. That's why I think that there is a space for an organization called European Values Center to meaningfully contribute to the civil society fabric in Taiwan, because we are not imposing values that are not recognized in Taiwan.
Oh,
are
we
trying
love these
to make
values.
a connection. Exactly. We are really trying to emphasize that these values can be as global as they are European, as you rightly remark. And that's why it's so important to foster cooperation that is cross-regional and truly international to uphold these values. Of course, there are domestic challenges, and we have to respect sovereignty of all countries that participate in the process of safeguarding these values. But generally, multilateral frameworks can be very useful in upholding the international rule-based order.
We've seen a lot of that in terms of, your good work, Marcin, with the Czech Republic and Taiwan. There was a phone call earlier this year with the president of the Czech Republic. How do you see that? Is this because China is driving these countries, especially Eastern European countries that don't have a historic tie with Taiwan, to come closer?
I think that even though Central Eastern European countries might not have a clear historical link to Taiwan, there are similarities in our respective historical trajectories. I have already emphasized that Taiwan and Central Eastern European countries began the process of transitioning to democracy around the same time. In political science, we say that Taiwan and Central Eastern European countries belong to the so-called third wave of democratization, which is the largest wave of democratization we have ever witnessed in
One of the newest waves.
history. Exactly. So it began with the revolution of carnations in Portugal and has continued throughout the 1990s. And I think that it is precisely that similar historical legacy that allows Central Eastern European people to really empathize with the experience of Taiwan. And I think that the expanding cooperation between countries like the Czech Republic and Lithuania rests not only on pragmatic considerations. I mean, these countries recognize Taiwan as one of the economic and technological powerhouses of our increasingly interconnected world, but also on normative considerations, meaning that especially amid the ongoing war in Ukraine, it becomes crystal clear that regional authoritarian hegemons are trying to undermine values that we cannot afford to take for granted simply because the fight for them is still so new and so fresh in our respective national psyches. And the confluence of these two factors, pragmatic and normative, is what makes those bonds really meaningful and sustainable.
On values, indeed.
I think that's a great point to make. And I just wanted to pivot a little bit to China. And I think, China is tough for us. It's tough for countries anywhere in the world. I was in the United States when attitudes towards China really shifted. I mean, there was hope and optimism after China joined the WTO that economic liberalization would one day lead to political liberalization, and that would lead to a more peaceful and secure region here in the Indo-Pacific. But unfortunately, I think those expectations and hopes were dashed under the increasingly authoritarian rule of Xi Jinping in recent years. That's very much a US-centric perspective, I understand that. But I am curious, from a European perspective, how is China seen today? And how do Europeans feel how the long-term trajectory of Chinese or Xi Jinping's rule could take there? Are there concern not only at the risk posed towards Taiwan, but to democratic values all over the world?
I think that what you just described is not only an American perspective. I think that a lot of similar sentiments can be felt around Europe. Of course, overall, Europe is not as hawkish in its approach to China, and there is still a desire to try to engage with China meaningfully, not only in terms of economics, but also shared global concerns. So, for example, cooperation on biodiversity and challenges related to the climate crisis remain quite high up on the European agenda when it comes to engaging China. At the same time, this idea of achieving democracy or transitioning to a more democratic system of rule through an economic approach is not only something that was believed in Washington, D.C. In Europe, we have often spoken of Wandel durch Handel, so transition through trade. Which is, as you may hear from the words I just uttered, a German concept. And I think that a current challenge in Europe is that the continent really needs to wake up to this new geopolitical reality where we recognize that Wandel durch Handel is not really viable.
I think
That
it's happening. I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think it's happening. I mean, we've seen the actions that Germany has now taken through not only their defense ministry but foreign ministry. These recent actions they've adopted through this new strategy on China they'd have in place. So I do think that transition is happening step by step. Do you feel that's the case?
Absolutely. However, one challenge when it comes to building a European approach towards China is that the European Union rests on the idea of a consensus. And it's not always easy to build consensus when you have 27 member states that have to agree on a single approach. And I think that China was actually very cunning in exploiting this difficulty in consensus building by implementing divisive formats such as 17, 16, and now 14
Yeah,
plus 1.
that's right.
That's why finding a common position of the European Union on Taiwan might be difficult as well.
Previously, I had worked quite closely with European countries, not only in a foreign ministry perspective, but also what I was working for think tanks and for the Democratic Progressive Party. And I do feel that European attitudes have shifted somewhere. And every European country has their own unique historical relationship with China. I mean, France was one of the first countries in the world to recognize the People's Republic. And I think one of the first Western countries to do so. And so has been a sense, I think, in Paris in years past that France gets China better than many other European country. Although I tend to think that even with the Macron visit, that idea has slowly shifted. Not the idea that they got China, but the idea that their assumptions have always been right about China. I think those perceptions will continue to shift as we see actions that the Chinese have taken, the PRC has taken, not only in Hong Kong, the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait here in Xinjiang, but also being driven sort of by public opinion in Europe that has really turned away from that. And I think there's an increasing similarity, and I can't speak on behalf of Europeans, but this is my perspective, that many people around the world feel in respect to Russia and China and how they sort of stand on the same side, so to say, on spreading this authoritarian value. So that's my perspective, but I'll be curious to hear yours, Marcin.
I think that it is really crucial to understand that other than moving away from the Wandel, durch, Handel perspective, another geopolitical reality to which Europeans are waking up is that there is an increasing confluence of strategic interests between Beijing and Moscow. So what you mentioned about China and Russia standing together in their attempts to spread the authoritarian agenda is very true.
Marcin, I am curious to bring this a little back to what you're doing here in Taipei. So the European Center for Values has been in Taipei for a few years now. You've been very active in the think tank sphere. You've been very active in public speaking. Could you share a bit about what are some of your priorities here in Taiwan? What are some of the work that you've been engaged in? And personally for you, I mean, what's been some of your most rewarding achievements or accomplishments here in Taipei?
Thank you for this question. So we are now in our second year of operations of our Taiwan office of the European Values Center for Security Policy, and we seek to position ourselves as the main hub for political and social exchange between Taiwan and Central Eastern Europe. And we do it primarily by engaging members of the civil society, academics, and also civil servants in relevant departments, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of National Defense. And I would say that one of the most rewarding projects on which I worked was my contribution to the recent visit of Markéta Pekarová-Adamová, the Speaker of the Czech House of Deputies. It was one of the largest international delegations that came to Taiwan in its recent history. And one of the events that we as EVC organized during her visit was a conference at the National Taiwan University. And I really believe in the power of engaging young people and harnessing the power of political socialization. You know, people who are in college, people who are still in education, are still developing their political selves. And it was really great to see how excited students and faculty at NTU were about this possibility to connect with European perspectives.
You've been very involved in also bringing Ukraine closer to Taiwan. We talked about that earlier in the podcast. What more moves do you feel can bring the two countries closer?
We sent the first medical team from Asia over to Ukraine to help support medical issues in Ukraine. And I thought that was a very positive step forward. So it's a great question.
So I will turn to my right and I will look at you, Vincent, given your position in the city council. And I'm doing this because I think that as we move forward and try to build stronger and more sustainable ties between Taiwan and Ukraine, the role of sister city to sister city diplomacy, the role of subnational diplomacy really cannot be undervalued. I think that when it comes to government engagement or engagements between the capitals, there might still be some hurdles, as there is still hope in Ukraine that China could meaningfully participate in the post-war recovery. However, politicians at subnational level have much more flexibility to engage with Taiwan. And I think that the basis of any meaningful relationship should be people-to-people ties. And these are, and the subnational diplomacy format really lends itself well to building mutual understanding and fostering those interpersonal connections. A lot has been achieved in that regard, and I still see a lot of potential as we move forward.
Well, mission received. Thank you so very much, Marcin. I mean, we appreciate your time. You've been a wonderful resource in sharing with not only the Taiwanese public, but the international community, the values that bring Europe and Taiwan close together. So I'm extremely grateful for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcin.